Our next student-led presentation is Xander Schwartz. And Xander's presentation is a different approach to batter-pitcher matchups. Xander.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Give me half a second to get this working. Okay. You guys can see everything and hear me, I hope. Okay, so welcome to my, thank you. Welcome to my paper, Improving Batter Pitcher at Bat Modeling Using K-means Clustering and Mixture Models. Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to share my research. To start, I want to talk about the way we tell baseball's story. I believe the story of baseball is often told through sample sizes that are way too small, often to a fault. If you look at these tweets from prominent baseball media, we are often told small samples batter versus pitcher matchups hold weight for a big game today and have some sort of predictive merit. But if you dig more deeply into the numbers, which we will do, these stats don't end up holding that much merit because the samples are too small. This study aims to show an alternative to baseball's small sample size problem, at least when it comes to batter versus pitcher matchups. So let's start with the question. What does it mean to be 4 for 9? You can look at this as a binomial distribution with 9 trials and 4 successes, but it's a really small sample size. If you look at the graph visually, the area under the curve is really spread out, which implies a lot of possible results. If you had a theoretical 200 hitter, and I told you they went 4 for 9, you would say that's totally possible. It's not going to happen all that often, but a 200 hitter can go 4 for 9 a couple times during the season. If you had a mythical 700 hitter, you'd say the same thing. And you can create a confidence interval based off of that. And a 95% confidence interval shows that the likely true batting average of a hitter that you just know is 4 for 9, that's all the information you have, would be between 137 to 788, which is a really wide interval. So saying somebody is 4 for 9 has some predictive value is a really misleading idea, because saying someone's 4 for 9 means they probably have between a 130 and a 790 batting average, and that's not that useful. So in other words, what does it mean to be 4 for 9? It's pretty useless. Alternatively, what does it mean to be 40 for 90? Obviously, it's a much larger sample size, and this leads to a much narrower confidence interval. So if you were going to compare the two, you would see that on the right, you have your 40 for 90, and on your left, you have your 4 for 9 batter. And they have the same mean theoretical idea of what their true batting average would be, but the confidence interval is much more narrow. So we can say with a lot more confidence that the 40 for 90 hitter is actually probably good. And this helps us to actually be able to draw meaningful conclusions, such as answering questions saying, has this player actually improved since the swing change? Or does this player's stats against this pitcher actually hold real meaning? So saying somebody is 40 for 90, that's pretty useful. That has real predictive merit. But the problem in baseball is we have small sample sizes. Between 2015 to 2019, batters versus pitchers had 2.25 at-bats on average against each other, not including that at-bat. And you might be wondering, why do I use data from 2015 to 2019? 2 reasons. First of all, the first one's very practical. It's the full seasons of baseball savant data that I had at the time when I started this project. And secondly, long-term history is also problematic. So say you had a theoretical 30-year-old hitter taking on a 20-year-old pitcher. They did really well. And then 10 years later, they're still playing, and the 40-year-old hitter is now facing the same 30-year-old pitcher. And we're going to say because they did well 10 years ago when the players were very different, it still holds some predictive merit. That seems flawed too, because players' skill level changes, and what they're good at and aren't good at also changes. And that example came from a Dave Cameron Fangraphs article talking about this exact situation. He was looking at a situation where it was Raul Ibanez playing CC Sabathia and saying, why does it matter if someone was good 10 years ago? We need more recent data. And that just doesn't exist. Even the most common matchup over these 5 years was Lorenzo Cain versus Jose Quintana, which makes sense. Cain was on the Royals and the Brewers and about the exact same time that Quintana was on the White Sox and Cubs. And it was just 71 plate appearances, or at bats rather, which is like a decent sample size, but it's still just 2.4% of all of Cain's at bats that time were against Quintana, and 1.8% of Quintana's batters faced were against Cain. So even when it's a bigger sample size, it's still not that much. So the solution is we have to somehow make our small sample sizes bigger. And the way we're going to do that is group similar pitchers. So we're going to rephrase the question from how does this batter do well against a certain pitcher to how does this batter do well against a certain type of pitcher. And this presents an interesting trade-off because we are increasing our sample size, which is beneficial, but we're also decreasing our sample quality, which is not what we want, because instead of saying, okay, we're looking at just one picture, we're looking at a group of similar pictures, so it's far less homogeneous. So the overall question of this paper is increasing sample size worth the decrease in sample quality, at least for this situation of grouping similar pictures? So we have to ask the question, what makes pictures similar? And for this study, I looked at 4 different statistics: pitch rate, velocity, spin rate, and release point. So pitch rate is pretty intuitive. Every pitcher has some attributes that help to make them unique, but the actual pitches they throw are pretty important. Even more importantly is how often they throw each of their pitches, as there's a big difference between someone who throws a fastball 30% of the time versus 80% of the time, even if they have the same secondaries. One example of pitchers that have pretty similar pitch rates, which I thought was kind of interesting, is Adam Wainwright and John Lester, which you can see in this StatCast visualization. And they were actually grouped together for part of my study because they both throw primarily cutters with fastballs, sinkers, curveballs, and changeups as secondaries. But you could also see there might be some issues in saying that Lester and Wainwright are similar. I'll get into that later, but their pitch types are pretty similar. So the next attribute is velocity, which is not surprising that velocity matters. It's measured in miles per hour. But there's a pretty big difference between a pitcher who's throwing 98 versus 88. And to illustrate an example, take Steven Matz and Kyle Hendricks. They have a very similar pitch mix. They both lean heavily on a mix of four-seam fastballs and sinkers with changeup and curveball secondaries, but there's a pretty massive difference in their pitch velocities, which you can see in another StatCast visualization. Matz throws a little bit above average on all his pitches, and Hendricks throws dramatically slower on each of his pitches. So it's problematic to just look at pitch rates because these are 2 very different pitchers, even if they throw the same pitches. They just aren't the same. So the next thing to look at is spin rate. And spin rate is measured in revolutions per minute, and an increase in spin rate can help add more movement to breaking pitches. It helps to keep fastballs elevated longer. One illustrative example of why spin rate matters is comparing Zach Greinke to Sixto Sanchez. Of course, Zach Greinke is a unicorn, but last season his fastball averaged 89 miles per hour with a spin rate of 2,300 RPM. Sixto, on the other hand, averaged 98 miles per hour with a spin rate of around 2,100. Greinke allowed a 338 WOBA on his fastballs, which isn't great, but it's about the same as facing Chris Taylor every time or Mitch Haniger. Sixto allowed a WOBA of 362, which is about the same as Carlos Correa. So in short, Greinke's notable spin rate advantage beat out Sixto's velocity bump. And this is just one example. It's a cherry-picked example, but spin rate can make up for a lack of velocity, although having both is obviously better. If you want more information, Devin Fink wrote a Fangraphs article a few years ago specifically looking at fastball velocity versus spin rate and basically found the same thing as the Greinke versus Sixto example. You want both, but spin rate can really help to make up for a lack of velocity. So then finally, you also have release point as the final thing that was looked at in terms of what makes pitchers similar. Release point was measured in XZ coordinates, which is the height of the release and also the distance from first to third. And when I say first to third, I mean like righty lefty. So it measures handedness as well and just your extension in that direction. So righties were measured as negative extension and lefties were measured as positive. And it matters because the way the ball released has a large impact on the way a hitter sees the ball. And this shows up in things like platoon splits or submarine pitchers having normally worse pitches, but decent stats because of their uniqueness and scarcity. The same is also true of lefties. So players like Tyler Rogers or Adam Simber, they benefit from having more unique release points. Finally, I want to get into my data set. So now that we've defined what makes pitchers similar, I want to talk about which pitchers I'm grouping. I grouped all pitchers from 2015 to 2019 that had over 100 of each of their pitches. This was a total of about 1,200 pitches, and I looked at modeling this over a little under 1 million at-bats. I took out ephesus, knuckleballs, forkballs, and screwballs because they were all very infrequent, and the only player actually affected was R.A. Dickey. But it's still important to note that less common pitchers still matter, or less common pitches still matter. So if you look at like a splitter, which makes up just about 1% of all pitches in the data set, and only 6% of pitchers throw it, but 20% or a little under 20% of pitches among pitchers who throw it are splitters. So splitters are still significant even if they only make up 1% of all pitches in the data set. So that's why they stayed. So to get into the methodology, there are 3 parts. First, we're going to group pitchers together. Then we need to create a model to figure out how does it work. Then we need to analyze, say, what methods work the best. So for grouping, we're going to group using k-means clustering and mixture models. And then we're going to create a model that uses information from our grouping mechanisms, test it on past at-bats. Then we're going to analyze our results and say, is grouping more effective? Is our trade-off worthwhile? And if grouping is more effective, which grouping method between k-means and mixture models is more effective? So the grouping methods are k-means and mixture models. K-means is probably the most common cluster method you will see. It very simply starts by assigning the first k points to individual groups, and then assigns the rest of the observations to the nearest group centroid, which is a theoretical mean point by looking at squared Euclidean distances, and then does this process over and over again until none of the points move. Mixture models use covariance matrices to help build its mixtures, but allow us to test different constraints on the covariance matrices in terms of volume, shape, and orientation that could help define the groups we create. Unlike k-means, mixture models are also probabilistic in that they can recognize uncertainty and say an observation may have some realistic chance to belong to multiple mixtures, whereas k-means will look at a point halfway between 2 clusters and definitively say, oh, it belongs to the one that's 51% closer to as opposed to 49% closer to. I also found that mixture models produced more uniform mixture models in the study given the constraints chosen versus k-means, which had a much less clear mode in terms of the number of pitchers per cluster, and had much higher variance in terms of cluster sizes. So after performing these 2 algorithms, we can take a look at the k-means results. I broke the 1,204 pitchers into 48 clusters, and the clusters were heavily focused on pitch rates. So players like John Lester and Adam Wainwright were grouped together because they, in general, threw similar pitches and threw them at similar rates. But also it had righties and lefties mixed. So if you noticed earlier that it's weird to group Wainwright and Lester together, k-means still decided to group them together, despite Lester being a lefty and Wainwright being a righty. If you reverse engineer the clusters using a decision tree to try to understand how it all worked, it also seemed like the clusters were heavily divided by fastball speeds and rates, both 2-seam and 4-seam being emphasized more than almost anything else. There were an average of 25 pitchers per cluster, a maximum of 107, and a minimum of 4. For the mixture model results, there were 38 mixtures produced by the mixture model algorithm. And the mixture model algorithm seemed far more focused on 2 things. Secondary pitch focus, such as do you throw a splitter? And every mixture was righty-lefty exclusive. So Adam Wainwright, John Lester were never put together. There were also some examples of clusters and mixtures that were nearly identical or heavily overlapping. So there were some clusters that were righty-lefty exclusive, but for the most part, they were mixed. So there were a few clusters that had the same. But I mentioned earlier that mixture models have the capacity to be probabilistic in saying that in this case, some pitcher might belong to different clusters or different mixtures and have some chance of belonging to however many mixtures that might be. But there were less than 20 pitchers who had more than a 10% chance of belonging to multiple mixtures, and they were all split between the same 3 mixtures. My mixture model algorithm had an average mixture size of 32, a maximum of 90, and a minimum of 4. So now what? We've created our model, or we've created our groupings, but how do we actually compare them? So we need to build our model. We're going to use beta binomial inference to do that and then generate posterior information. From there, we're going to use logistic regression to model each past at bat and model separately by batter versus pitcher, batter versus cluster, or batter versus mixture. Then we're going to compare and determine what's the best information and what does that tell us about the value of batter versus pitcher matchups versus batter versus grouping matchups. So what is beta binomial inference? It's a form of Bayes inference, and the basic concept is we assume every player comes from some distribution, which is called the prior. In this case, I chose to use a beta 1434 prior, as it closely matches the distribution of batting averages in the data set, as you can see in the plot. Is it still an arbitrary choice to use a beta 1434? Yes, but as you can see, the red line is pretty similar to the blue line, and we're trying to match up to the blue line as closely as possible. The next step is we have to add new information. which for this situation would be any of one of three pieces of information: the batter's history against the pitcher, their history against the batter's or the pitcher's cluster, or their history versus the pitcher's mixture, then update our distribution to generate a new posterior. To give an example, which is shown in this graph, let's say we start with our prior and then learn a player is 35 for 100 against a cluster. We want to use beta binomial inference to guess what their new true batting average is against a pitcher in that cluster. So the process can be seen where the red line is our prior, the black line is our new information, saying they're 35 for 100 or have a 350 batting average. And then the blue line is our new distribution. So you can see that shifts closer to our new information, but then also narrows because we have more information. We have a smaller confidence interval. And then that way we can generate probably better conclusions than just starting with our prior. So then we have this new information. We have our new prediction for what their batting average would be. And we're going to then create a logistic regression model using that information. So we predicted every at bat in which both the batter and the pitcher had 30 plus at bats that season, or 30 plus batters faced. And then we're predicting their expected batting average for each of those at bats, which, as I said earlier, was just under 1 million at bats that we were predicting. The model inputs were the batter's season-long batting average, the pitcher's season-long batting average against. Both of those will help to control for the skill level, because you don't want to run into a situation in which the sample size is increased, but all we really are finding is that a good batter did well in a sample, and therefore they're a good batter. We want to control for that. And also the beta binomial posterior. And then after we've created our model, we're going to compare the outputs. And the outputs are going to be compared on 5 metrics, which is the test set accuracy using an 80-20 split, a ANOVA likelihood ratio test, a pseudo R-squared, a Hosmer-Lemeshow goodness of fit test, and a variable importance test. And you might be wondering, why do you use all of these? And part of that is just that there isn't an easy R-squared value for logistic regression in the same way there is for linear regression. There's not one simple catch-all that says, oh, this is clearly, this model is this good, or this variable is this important in some clear, definitive way. So having 5 different tests helps to build a consensus about which methods were the best. So we've built our logistic regression, and now we can actually see the full results. The results were definitive. On every single test, the mixture model groupings proved to be the most informative, and k-means proved to be more informative than just grouping together, or just batter versus pitcher. So the trade-off was worth it. The trade-off of saying batter versus pitcher is not as useful as batter versus a group, but in particular a batter versus a mixture. So you can use this for a lot of different reasons. I'll get into the applications, which is the easiest one is probably lineup construction. If you're trying to say, which player do we think we should we bat today? You could look at, how does this batter do against the starting pitcher's mixture? The reverse of it is also true. You could think about it in terms of bullpen management. If you want to say, which pitcher should we bring in today? You could look at which batter has struggled most, or which pitcher's mixture has the upcoming batter struggled most against. You could also use this for gambling purposes, saying we should bet on the team with the best numbers versus the opposing pitcher's mixture. And similarly, on a more micro level, you could say, let's select players with good numbers versus a given pitcher's mixture, which probably isn't going to be found in the dollar values normally found in daily fantasy. There are probably many more applications, but these are the ones that I came up with. In terms of future work, I think there are some natural extensions to this project that could also provide interesting findings. Firstly, I looked at just batting average. It's very objective and easy to measure, but if you wanted to, you could also measure things like OPS, WRC+, xWOBA, WOBA, or any other metric you want to. You could also try to cluster on skill level rather than attributes. So say, does a thing as a hitter who hits better than expected against really good pitching or really bad pitching exist? You could also try to cluster hitters, but there are a lot fewer data points you can use to cluster hitters as opposed to pitchers that help clearly differentiate them. You probably have to get into biomechanical data, which I don't have access to, but I think it could also possibly turn into a very similar study where your clusters of hitters are really hitters who all hit well against the same cluster of pitchers. It would also be great to incorporate minor league data and massively increase your sample size and see if the trade-off is still worthwhile, but then you need minor league StatCast data, which isn't publicly available. And there's also some way to leverage the probabilistic nature of mixture models to strengthen your mixture groupings even more. And That's it. If you would like to see the full paper, I have 3 different versions of the paper for different backgrounds, including the full paper, a paper that has the same conclusion, same work, but is just for people with a baseball background, and one that's just for people with a stats background. All of them can be found at this link or the QR code, as well as the full code to my GitHub repository for this project and contact information. Thank you so much all for listening, and I will get to the questions. Wait a second. Okay. Christian asked, why did you use at-bats instead of plate appearances? You absolutely could do the exact same project with plate appearances and OBP instead of at-bats. It was an arbitrary choice. I think at-bats was just the easiest thing to quickly look at, but I think you could probably do the exact same thing with plate appearances and find the same exact result. I don't think one is clearly better than the other. Did you consider, Christian also asked, did you consider pitch movement as a similar possibility? I think I tried to use spin rate as a proxy for pitch movement, but you could probably also look at like vertical or horizontal break and come to a similar conclusion, but I think it would be very highly correlated with spin rate. So I would lean more towards looking at spin rate just as a quick proxy, but I think it would also have pretty similar conclusions. John asked, why were the sinkers and 2 seamers buckets not combined? That's another good question. I think for that, I just relied mostly upon the StatCast data provided and decided that if StatCast wanted to clearly differentiate those as 2 separate pitches, then combining them just seemed like an arbitrary choice that you could do. But also if StatCast says it's one way, I think that's probably a more objective source than choosing to combine them, just because sure, they are similar, but I think there's enough of a differentiation that it might be easier to acknowledge the differentiation rather than combining them. Jack asked about a GitHub. You can find that right here. My entire code for the project is here. There's also all the data came from the baseball R package, which I should also give credit to, which helps scrape Savant. So you can just run, you can click one button and it will run the entire project. Dylan asked, do you think if you would have separated left-handers and right-handers for k-means, that would have been closer to the results of the mixture model? Probably. That was the thing I was most struck by running the program for the first time, was seeing just that k-means decided to gloss over for the most part the difference. And I felt like, as somebody who is a baseball fan and follows baseball analytics, I would have said that seemed like a pretty clear flaw to try to say that those were not the same thing, or say that those could be the same thing rather. So I expect that if you were able to combine lefties and right, or differentiate lefties and righties with k-means, that would make up a large part of the gap. I don't know how much it would make up, but I expect that as a pretty big inflection point for why mixture models clearly outperformed k-means, was that specific decision. Brian asked, could it be better to match a batter versus expected pitch mix rather than a group of pitcher? Trying to think through that question on the fly. I guess I'm not entirely sure what the question means in terms of whether it's asking, are you trying to predict how a pitcher would attack a certain batter? So even if the pitcher threw 15% curveballs and this batter struggled against curveballs and you throw a 30% rate expected against this batter, I think you could do something like that, but I might also be misinterpreting your question, so I'm sorry if so. Eli asked, for guys like Simber, whose release point would be far from other pitchers, what did you do in general if a group has a small number of members? So I think that gets to the overall question of how do we increase sample sizes? And for the most part, if you look through some of the mixtures and clusters, you would find like, oh, here's a group of submarine pitchers, and maybe they're less similar on things like curveballs or sliders or secondary pitches, but because they were such an outlier in terms of being a submarine pitcher, that they were grouped together, the sample size is going to be smaller. And there were clusters that were as big as 100 pitchers in a cluster that were all pretty similar. And those were all like very, very heavy fastball pitchers versus clusters with 4 pitchers in them. And that's something that I think you will probably have better results if the cluster is larger, but it's also the trade-off of you want things to be as homogeneous as possible. So the larger clusters might also have more variation between the pitchers, if I had to bet. So I think if you were trying to say that, that's just part of the deal, is you aren't going to find 10 pitchers like Adam Simber necessarily, or 50 pitchers like Adam Simber. And you do it where you can, and you recognize there's probably a higher error bar between pitchers that you don't necessarily have the same quality of information for. Stephen asked, is this coursework or is this self-taught or coursework? A lot of this was learned at Amherst College, where I'm a junior at, but also a lot of the baseball work is mostly just self-taught in terms of trying to get into baseball analytics and be passionate about it and work on the research for it. But in terms of, like, I learned what k-means clustering was in a class, and I was like, oh, mixture models are an interesting extension. I understand clustering now. Let's go try a different clustering algorithm. Daniel asked, what is the justification for the choice of prior distribution? How data dependent are the hyperparameter choices? That's a good question. I think, so the justification for the beta 1434, and I can go back to that quickly. Sorry. So for the beta 1434, this was a question I was trying to grapple with, of how do I set a prior that is as accurate as possible? And any prior is going to be arbitrary to some extent. There's not going to be this is the perfect prior that at least I can think of in terms of a beta binomial context. But I was trying to find something that would match my expected batting average as close as I possibly could in the batting average distribution found in my data set. So I tried many, many different combinations of trying to figure out what would most closely match the blue line seen on the graph on the left. And I wanted to find a way to match that closely, and I found a beta 1434 worked really well. But I also think one of the larger parts of this project that I've given a lot of thought to is this is as much a proof of concept. If I can show that this idea works with probably slightly suboptimal choices, there might be a better way of doing different parts of this. It would work even better with more optimal choices. So there might be a 5% better prior distribution than beta 1434. But if it works for beta 1344, it's definitely going to work even better for a better distribution. I don't see any more questions, and I think I'm out of time, but thank you all so much for watching my presentation. If you would like to reach out or contact me, you can find my information right here. Thank you so much.
Xander, thank you for joining us. That was terrific, and hope to see more from you and also from Julia in the future.